Hello friends, it's Shari. Today I am sharing a fun tutorial using the Peppermint Twist dies from Poshta Design. In my tutorial today I am just making the round peppermint, but as you can see there are also dies to cut a candy cane and the coordinating stripes. I am of course using classic white and red. I think this is Cardinal and Tundra if you're using the Poshta Design colors. I cut the main circle piece from the white, and you can see that it cuts all of those stitching holes for the outside of the peppermint as well as the holes to stitch the stripes to the peppermint. And then of course I cut the stripe piece or that little swirl out of the red. Now I'm cutting my floss here. I have a piece of white and I split mine in half. So I'm using 3 strands of white embroidery floss, and I'll just put the other piece aside because I will probably end up using that later as well. And what you always want to do with these is to stitch all the details before you stitch the front and the back together. So I will start out by stitching that red peppermint swirl onto the front of this peppermint circle. Now you want to take this and these holes will line up. So I just carefully line them up. They're pretty easy to see. If you punch out all the little holes, which is what I always do before I start, you can hold them up to the light and see if you've got your holes lined up, which is what I'm doing here. I'm just holding it up to my desk lights and I can see the light shine through those holes, so I know it is in the right place. Now you want to stitch just those lines that go from the outside to the center. We're just stitching the swirl onto the peppermint first. We're not stitching around the outside. Now I started on the outside and I like to go in a running stitch. So every other hole back and forth to my end point, which in this case will be the center. And then I go back to the outside. Now for this one, what I actually did was I went up the other side, still doing my running stitch. So I basically made a V shape. And then now that I'm to the outside edge, I'll go back into the holes that I skipped and fill in those stitches, and I will complete my V shape. You could also start in the center if you wanted and go from the center to the outside edge and back every time, whichever way works best for you. What I did find by starting on the outside edge first is when I got back here to where I started, I had to kind of travel over to the next one, which isn't such a big deal. I'm actually going to tie it off first before I do that because I left that tail hanging. So now everything's tied off. I will just move over to the next stripe and I'm going to do the same thing, starting at the outside edge, going to the center with a running stitch. I'll go back up the other side of this particular stripe, and then once I'm to the edge again, I will go back and fill in those stitches. Now on my second peppermint I made for my projects, I did go from the center out each time, which I liked that way too. You just do whatever works for you. And when I get back here and I'm going to travel to the next one, you're going to see me kind of tack it underneath one of those stitches to keep that traveling stitch away from the edge of my circle. So now you can see I've stitched all those lines. I want to add my embellishments next. For these peppermints, I am adding a sequin and a bead in the center. You can see I have one strand of red floss. I've just tacked it under one of the stitches that are already there, and then I tied it in a knot. So now it is anchored on the back. I'm going to come up through that center hole, and I will grab one of these red sequins. And I am actually using a thinner needle for this to make sure that I can fit one of these beads over the eye of my needle. So then I picked up a clear bead, and then I will go back through the sequin, and that bead is going to hold my sequin in place. Now I actually added a few more embellishments on this. I added some clear sequins within those white areas. So you're going to see me do that next. And of course I need to change my thread to do that because I don't want red thread through a clear sequin on white felt. So I'll just tack this under another stitch just like I did when I started, go back through and make a loop and knot this off. Now you can see on my second peppermint, which is actually the back side of this one, I've already added my sequin in the center, and you can see I have some little beads laying out in the white. They're not actually tacked down. I just kind of left them there as me figuring out where I wanted to add these little embellishments, and I'm using it as a go-by for the one I'm working on right now. So I did one or two in each of the white areas, and I'm just using my go-by up there. I'm using one strand of white floss. I'm coming up where I want that bead to be, picking up that bead, and then going back into the felt just a little bit off from where I came through so that it's not exactly in the same hole. And these beads are clear with a little bit of iridescent shimmer to them. And I think that it just adds some kind of sprinkly, sugary look to the felt peppermints. So I'm just speeding things up a little bit here so you can see me tack all these little beads down. Again, I did one or two. Some of those sections I used two just so it didn't look too symmetrical. And once I have all those in place, I will just tack it under one of those stitches and tie it off in a knot. And you can do one knot or two. I usually do two just to be secure, and then I'm trimming off all those tails. So here's one side of my peppermint done, and then I will go through and add all of those clear beads to the other one that's laying there as well. Now that I have them both done, I am going to sew my front and my back together, and here is my little trick for stuffing these. I don't want them too puffy, I just want a little bit of puff, and I think it is way easier to add batting to the inside of these. So I traced around my die, so I have this circle. Now when I have those dies that are not solid, I usually trace inside of the die because I don't want the batting where my holes are. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is now that I have the outside circle, I'm going to cut it a little bit smaller on the inside. Most of the time, I just kind of eyeball it. This time, I am just sort of drawing an inside circle with my pen very lightly so I can have a little guide on where to cut and you can see it a little better as well. So I'll just go through and trim this circle down a little bit, and this is just to make that batting be on the inside of those stitching holes that are around the outside of the circle. So you can see there how that is going to work and fill in the inside. Now that I have a circle the right size, I can use this sort of as a template and cut as many as I need for my peppermint. So if I wanted a very puffy peppermint, I could add more layers of this batting, cut to these circles. You could even cut one a little bit smaller so they're kind of graduated within that peppermint, depending on how puffy you want it to be. I actually made two peppermints, so this was a good time to cut all the circles I needed for the two peppermints I was creating. Now I am going to do 2 layers of batting inside this one, so it is nice and chunky. And I just like to layer them inside, line everything up. Now you could line up the stripes. I decided to put the stripes alternating. So where I have a stripe on the front, I turned the back to where the stripe falls in between. And then I can stitch the two together. So I started with my string between the two pieces, so that tail there is coming out from in between the two white pieces, like where the batting is. And then I'm going to go all the way around with the white, and you can see now this is why we don't stitch the outside edge of those stripes, because they're going to get stitched in this step. And if you stitched them earlier, you would end up with 2 layers of floss and it would look chunky and not quite as nice and neat. So I'm just kind of pulling it a little taut there. This one's a little fat because I have so much batting in there, so it was kind of poofed out and my stitches weren't nice and tight. So once I got a few in there, I could pull those a little tighter and not pull the tail out. And again, just as before, on this one, I'm going to do a running stitch all the way around to where I started. And if you were going to make an ornament, this is where you would probably add the hanger. Now, I did not make ornaments. I made like a bowl filler or something you could tuck into the tree instead of hang. So I don't have a hanger on mine, and you'll see why. It's because I'm going to add some cellophane around it and make it look like a wrapped up candy. So I will just continue around to my start point, which is about right here. And then I will start going back in the other direction from whence I came and fill in those other stitches. It is kind of a cool look to leave it as every other stitch if that's what you want. I like to do things both ways. It just depends on the project. And you're going to see I didn't have enough to get all the way back around, so I'm going to have to add another piece of floss. So to do that, I want to come out in between my two white pieces of felt with my needle, so my little tail is coming out in between so that when we tie it off later, we can hide that knot and that tail inside of the peppermint. So I've got another piece of floss here, and where I came out in between, that's where I'm going to start. So if I was going from front to back, but I came out in between, I am going to still go front to back, but I'm going to start in between. So both of those tails are basically in the same spot, coming out in between my layers. And then I will just keep working my way around till I get the whole thing stitched back to where I started. So now I have all these little tails sticking out. They're coming out from in between my white layers. So I'll just trim that off. That one was a little long. And I will tie these two together. I like to tie two knots so everything's nice and secure. But when you pull that knot tight, it's going to go down in between those layers and you're not really going to see it. So I've got to do this one right here where I had to start and stop a new strand. And I'm just doing the same thing, tying those two together, pulling that knot nice and tight so it goes down in between those layers. And then what I'll do is I'll take my needle and I'll thread these tails back into my needle. And then I like to thread this in between those layers and then out the back or the front, usually the back. This one, the back and the front are basically the same. But if you go in between and come out somewhere in here in the middle, you can trim off the tail, and then that piece that's left gets hidden inside your little ornament. And of course, I am going to do the same to these other two tails here. I usually do end up having to thread them through separately because they're never usually the same length, and sometimes threading 6 strands through the eye of a needle can be a little difficult. So I usually thread them through separately, which is what you're seeing me do here. And then once I have all of those hidden, my little peppermint is done. Now this is really cute. You could just tuck it in a tree, put it in a bowl. I wanted to show you my second one. I used red around the outside so you get kind of a different look. You could also stitch the stripes in with red and not see that white stitching, but there's lots of possibilities depending on the look you want. Now I have a piece of cellophane. This is just the cellophane that you buy in a roll, to wrap up a basket or whatever. And I'm going to trim it down. I decided to trim it in my paper trimmer. It felt a little easier to do it this way because this was kind of long. So once I trimmed it down to a smaller size to work with, it was a little easier to deal with. So I have a smaller square of cellophane here, and I was trying to figure out how to wrap these up. I wanted to make them look like wrapped up peppermints with the ties like you would twist it, but I'm going to tie it with a bow. And so what I decided to do that would be best is use some thin double-sided tape. So that's what I have here. And I'm just going to tear it off to where it's the same width as the peppermint so that this piece of tape gets hidden on the back side of my peppermint. My little seam gets hidden on the back. So I'm going to put this right here, right along the edge of the cellophane. Then what I'm going to do is flip that over. So when I pull it like this, when I wrap it over, sticky side is sticking up and it's right behind my peppermint. I'm going to wrap the other side around and stick it down. Now I have excess here, so I'll just trim that off with my scissors. It was way easier to tack it down with that tape and then trim it than to try to figure out how big it needed to be. Now I can gather it on both sides of the peppermint. And I actually just kind of slid that seam around to where it was at the bottom of the peppermint, because once you kind of gather it, you you don't really see it very much. So the seam is now at the bottom rather than being on the back side. That way, if you put this in a bowl and it gets picked up or flipped around, there's not really a backside with the tape showing. Then I pulled out some red sheer ribbon and I'm tying these in a bow first. I ended up getting rid of the bow because I just thought it was a little too much going on with the bow and the peppermint. I wanted to simplify that a little bit. So you're seeing me tie some bows here, but what I'm actually going to end up doing is tying a knot and trimming off the tails. But I left this in here so you could see kind of the look if you wanted to tie the bows. It was just a little bit too much going on for me, so I'm untying that. I will fluff out the end a little bit here and tie it in a knot. So we got a knot instead of a bow, and then I can just trim off the end so I have little things. You could also use the twisty ties that come in like treat bags for treat bags. That would work too. A treat bag would probably work really well for this cellophane. The treat bags I had an iridescent color to them, and when I put my peppermint in there, I couldn't even see it. So I kind of ditched that idea and went with clear so I could see all that stitching I spent all that time on. So here is my fun peppermint all finished. I wrapped up the other one just the same, and I think these would be really cute just tucked in a tree, maybe one that's red and white and candy themed, or tucked in a bowl with some other holiday decor. I hope you found this tutorial helpful. Thank you so much for watching. Have an amazing stitchy day. Bye.